What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected legends walks into what should be a simple interview, only to face relentless disrespect from a host who thinks his platform gives him the right to say anything? It only took 36 seconds of condescending questions before the entire conversation exploded into one of the most shocking exits in talk show history. This is the story of how Harrison Ford had enough. The awkward hour was supposed to be different. Anderson Cooper had built his reputation on hard-hitting journalism, the kind that got to the truth, the kind that didn't let anyone off easy. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The probing questions became personal attacks, the tough interviews became ambush sessions. And on this particular night, he picked the wrong person to test. Harrison Ford walked onto that stage to what should have been applause and respect. The man had given audiences Indiana Jones, Han Solo, Rick Deckard, decades of iconic performances that shaped cinema itself. But as he sat down across from Anderson, something felt off immediately. The energy in the room was tense, cold, even. Anderson barely let Harrison settle into his seat before launching in. "So, Harrison," Anderson started, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's address what everyone's really thinking. You're here promoting another movie, another franchise revival, another attempt to recapture the glory days. Do you ever worry that you're just recycling the past?" The audience went quiet. That wasn't a question, that was a shot. Harrison's expression didn't change, but you could see it in his eyes. That flash of recognition. He knew exactly what kind of interview this was going to be. "I make movies I believe in," Harrison replied evenly. "Movies that mean something to me, and hopefully to audiences too." But Anderson wasn't done. He leaned forward now, his tone shifting into something more aggressive. "But that's the thing, isn't it? The audiences aren't showing up like they used to. Your last 3 films underperformed. The reviews were mixed at best. Some critics even said you looked tired on screen. Do you think maybe it's time to step aside? Let the younger generation take over?" You could hear the gasp from the audience. This wasn't journalism. This was disrespect. This was someone using their platform to tear down a guest under the guise of asking tough questions. Harrison took a breath. His jaw tightened just slightly. "I think," he said carefully, "that critics are entitled to their opinions. But I show up, I do the work, and I give everything I have to every role. That's all any actor can do." Right, Anderson said dismissively, waving his hand like Harrison's answer was some rehearsed publicity line. "But let's be honest here. You've played the same character archetype for 40 years. The grumpy guy with a heart of gold, the reluctant hero. Don't you think audiences are tired of seeing the same performance over and over?" The audience was fully uncomfortable now. This had crossed a line. People shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances. This wasn't entertaining. This was cruel. Harrison's eyes narrowed. His voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "I don't play archetypes," he said. "I play human beings, complex people with flaws and strengths. If you see them as the same, maybe that says more about how you're watching than how I'm performing." It was a perfect response. Measured, dignified, firm, without being aggressive. He wasn't going to let Anderson reduce his life's work to some dismissive soundbite. But Anderson wasn't backing off. If anything, Harrison's pushback seemed to energize him, like a shark smelling blood in the water. Okay, Anderson said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Let's talk about something else then. Your personal life. You've been married 3 times. That's a lot of failed relationships for someone who plays romantic leads on screen. Do you think there's a disconnect there between the roles you play and the man you actually are?" The audience audibly gasped. Someone in the back even shouted, "Come on," in protest. This had gone from uncomfortable to completely out of bounds. Harrison stared at Anderson for a long moment. The silence stretched out, heavy and charged. "My personal life," Harrison finally said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is personal. It has nothing to do with my work. And frankly, it's none of your business." "But you're a public figure," Anderson pressed, clearly enjoying himself now. "You've made millions of dollars playing these characters that audiences fall in love with. Don't you think they deserve to know the real you? The guy who couldn't make his marriages work? The guy who, by some accounts, was difficult to work with on set?" "By some accounts," Harrison repeated slowly, "meaning rumors, meaning gossip. You're sitting here treating tabloid garbage like it's fact." "I'm sitting here asking questions that people want answers to," Anderson shot back. "Isn't that what journalism is?" "No," Harrison said flatly. That's what exploitation is. The tension in the studio was suffocating now. The audience didn't know whether to applaud Harrison or stay silent. The crew behind the cameras looked uncomfortable, unsure if they should intervene. Anderson leaned back again, that same smirk returning to his face. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think you're sensitive because there's truth to it. I think you know your best work is behind you, and you're desperately trying to stay relevant in an industry that's moved on without you." That was it. That was the moment. Harrison Ford, a man known for his composure, for his ability to stay cool under pressure, for his professionalism even in the most challenging situations, had reached his limit. He stood up. "We're done. Here," Harrison said simply. Anderson's smirk faltered. He clearly hadn't expected this. "Wait, what?" "Harrison, come on, sit down. We're in the middle of an interview." "No," Harrison said, already unclipping his microphone. "We're not. An interview is a conversation. This is you trying to humiliate me for ratings, and I'm not participating in it." "Oh, so you're just going to walk out?" Anderson said, and now his tone had shifted to something defensive. "Very professional, very mature." Harrison stopped and turned back to face him. When he spoke, his voice carried across the entire studio. "You want to talk about professional? Professional is treating your guests with basic respect. Professional is asking real questions instead of lobbing insults disguised as journalism. Professional is understanding that just because you have a microphone and a camera doesn't give you the right to treat people like garbage." The audience erupted into applause. Huge, sustained applause. People were standing up. They'd been waiting for someone to say what they were all thinking. Anderson's face flushed red. He was losing control of his own show, and he knew it. "I was just doing my job," Anderson said weakly. "Your job," Harrison replied, "is to have conversations, not interrogations, not ambushes. You brought me here under false pretenses, and then you spent the entire time trying to make me look bad to make yourself look good. That's not journalism. That's ego." Another wave of applause, louder this time. Anderson tried to recover, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I think the audience can decide for themselves whether my questions were fair or not." Harrison looked out at the still applauding audience, then back at Anderson. "They already have," he said. And with that, Harrison Ford walked off the stage. The camera operators didn't know what to do. One of them kept the camera on Harrison as he made his exit, his stride confident and unbothered. Another stayed on Anderson, who sat frozen in his chair, clearly stunned that his ambush had backfired so spectacularly. The audience was still applauding. Some people were even cheering. Anderson tried to speak into his microphone, tried to say something to regain control, but his voice was drowned out by the noise. He looked around at his producers in the wings, clearly hoping for direction, for some way to salvage this disaster. But there was nothing to salvage. In the span of just a few minutes, Anderson Cooper had gone from confident talk show host to a man who'd been thoroughly called out and exposed. He'd tried to use his platform to diminish a legend, and instead, he'd revealed exactly what kind of host he'd become. Someone more interested in spectacle than substance. Someone willing to hurt people for entertainment. Someone who'd forgotten the basic principle of respect. The production crew scrambled. Someone called for a commercial. Break. The lights shifted. Anderson sat there, still processing what had just happened, while the audience continued their standing ovation for a man who was no longer even in the room. What makes this moment so significant isn't just that Harrison walked out. Guests have walked out of interviews before. What makes it significant is why he walked out, and how. Harrison didn't lose his temper. He didn't yell or curse or throw things. He didn't stoop to Anderson's level. He simply drew a line and enforced it. He made it clear that there are boundaries, and when someone crosses them repeatedly, disrespectfully, and intentionally, you have every right to remove yourself from that situation. And the audience's reaction proved that they agreed with him completely. In those 36 seconds before everything fell apart, Anderson had made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that his position as host, his platform, his reputation gave him authority over his guest. He assumed he could say whatever he wanted, ask whatever he wanted, and Harrison would just sit there and take it because that's what guests do. But Harrison Ford isn't just any guest. He's someone who's spent decades earning respect through his work, his talent, and his integrity. And he wasn't about to let some talk show host tear that down for the sake of manufactured controversy. Every question Anderson asked was designed to provoke. calling Harrison's career recycled and irrelevant, attacking his box office numbers, mocking his acting as repetitive, dragging his personal relationships into it, suggesting he was difficult to work with based on unnamed sources and rumors. Each question was another jab, another attempt to get Harrison to react emotionally, to create a viral moment. But Anderson misread his guest completely. Harrison didn't give him anger. He gave him clarity. He didn't give him drama. He gave him dignity. And in doing so, he turned the entire situation around. When Harrison said, "We're done here," it wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a decision. A clear, conscious choice to remove himself from a toxic situation. And that's what made it so powerful. He wasn't running away. He was choosing self-respect over ratings, integrity over entertainment value. Anderson's attempts to stop him, to downplay what was happening, to frame Harrison's exit as unprofessional, only made things worse. Because everyone watching could see exactly what was happening. They'd witnessed the entire interview. They'd heard every disrespectful question. They'd seen Anderson's smirk, his dismissive tone, his obvious enjoyment of making his guest uncomfortable. So when he tried to claim he was just doing his job, nobody bought it. When he tried to act like Harrison was being overly sensitive, the audience's applause made it clear they disagreed. When he tried to maintain his authority as host, he'd already lost it. The beauty of this moment is in what Harrison didn't say as much as what he did say. He didn't attack Anderson personally. He didn't bring up Anderson's own controversies or career struggles. He didn't try to hurt him back. He simply called out the behavior for what it was: disrespectful, unprofessional, and motivated by ego rather than genuine curiosity or journalism. That's not journalism. That's ego. 6 words that cut through all of Anderson's justifications and excuses. 6 words that named exactly what everyone in that studio was feeling but perhaps couldn't articulate. And then Harrison did something even more powerful. He left. He didn't wait for an apology that wasn't coming. He didn't try to win some argument or get the last word beyond what he'd already said. He simply removed himself from the situation because he recognized it for what it was: a waste of his time and dignity. The audience's sustained applause, their standing ovation for someone who was already gone, spoke volumes. They weren't just applauding Harrison, they were applauding the boundary he'd set. They were applauding his refusal to be treated poorly just because he was on someone else's show. They were applauding the principle of self-respect. Think about what that audience reaction meant for Anderson in that moment. His own audience, the people who came to see his show, who presumably were fans of his work, were making it absolutely clear that they sided with the guest over him, that they found his questions inappropriate, that they respected Harrison's decision to leave more than they respected Anderson's attempts to create controversy. That's devastating for a host. Your job is to connect with your audience, to be their representative, to ask the questions they want answered. But when your audience is applauding your guest for walking out on you, you've fundamentally failed at that job. You've revealed that you're not speaking for them, you're speaking for yourself. Throughout the entire exchange, Harrison maintained his composure in a way that highlighted just how out of line Anderson's questions were. He didn't take the bait. He didn't get defensive in a way that would let Anderson claim he'd struck a nerve. He answered questions that deserved answers and refused to engage with ones that didn't. When Anderson brought up his marriages, Harrison's response was perfect. "My personal life is personal. It has nothing to do with my work, and frankly, it's none of your business." Simple, clear, non-negotiable. He wasn't going to be bullied into discussing things that had nothing to do with why he was there. And when Anderson tried to justify the invasive questions by saying, "You're a public figure," Harrison didn't fall for that either. Being a public figure doesn't mean you forfeit your right to privacy or boundaries. It doesn't mean talk show hosts get to treat your personal struggles as fodder for their ratings. But Anderson kept pushing. That was his fatal mistake. He thought he could wear Harrison down. Eventually, he'd get the reaction he wanted. Instead, what he got was a masterclass in how to handle disrespect with grace and firmness. Harrison's line about the disconnect between asking real questions and lobbing insults disguised as journalism was particularly cutting because it named the game Anderson was playing. He was hiding behind the veneer of tough journalism to justify being cruel. He was pretending his questions were legitimate when they were really just personal attacks. Real journalism seeks truth. It asks difficult questions when necessary, but it does so with respect and fairness. It doesn't belittle, it doesn't mock, it doesn't try to humiliate. Anderson wasn't doing journalism. He was doing performance art, and Harrison was supposed to be his prop. the target he could tear down to make himself look fearless and uncompromising. But props don't talk back, targets don't walk away, and Harrison Ford is neither. The moment when Harrison said, "You brought me here," under false pretenses is crucial because it reveals the setup. Harrison thought he was coming on the show for a normal promotional interview, a conversation about his work, maybe some personal anecdotes, the usual talk show fare. Instead, he walked into an ambush designed to create a viral moment at his expense. That's a betrayal of the basic trust between guest and host. When someone agrees to come on your show, there's an implicit agreement that you'll treat them fairly. You might ask tough questions, sure, but you won't deliberately try to humiliate them. You won't use your platform to attack them personally. You won't waste their time with gotcha questions and tabloid-level gossip. Anderson broke that trust. And once that trust is broken, there's no reason for the guests to stay and subject themselves to more of the same. What's striking about Harrison's exit is how calm it was. There was no dramatic storming off, no throwing papers or shouting. He simply stood up, stated clearly that they were done, explained why, and left. It was decisive, without being theatrical, firm without being aggressive. He treated the exit with the same professionalism that Anderson had failed to show during the interview. That contrast is important. Harrison proved that you can stand up for yourself. You can refuse to tolerate disrespect. You can walk away from a bad situation, all without losing your composure or dignity. You don't have to match someone's negative energy to effectively shut down their behavior. Anderson's attempt to frame the walkout as unprofessional or immature immediately backfired because everyone had just watched him spend the entire interview being both of those things. He'd been unprofessional in his questions. He'd been immature in his obvious enjoyment of making his guest uncomfortable. He'd been disrespectful in every possible way. So when he tried to claim the moral high ground, when he tried to position himself as the reasonable one, and Harrison as overly sensitive or unable to handle tough questions, it rang completely hollow. The audience wasn't fooled. They'd seen what happened. They knew who the problem was. Harrison's final comment, "They already have," in response to Anderson saying the audience could decide for themselves, was perfect. Because the audience was literally applauding Harrison's decision to leave. They were physically demonstrating their judgment of the situation. Anderson had asked them to decide, and they decided he was wrong. It's rare to see someone so thoroughly called out in real time like that. Usually when interviews go wrong, there's ambiguity. Maybe the guest was overly defensive. Maybe the host had a point. Maybe both sides share blame. But this wasn't ambiguous. This was clear-cut. Anderson had crossed every line, and Harrison had responded appropriately. The fact that the applause continued even after Harrison left the stage is telling. Usually when a guest leaves, the energy deflates. The audience doesn't know how to react. There's awkwardness and confusion. But this audience knew exactly how they felt. They were celebrating the boundary Harrison had set. They were supporting his decision. They were making it clear that they didn't approve of what Anderson had done. For Anderson, sitting there in his chair while his own audience applauded his guest for leaving him, that had to be a sobering moment. If he had any self-awareness at all, he had to recognize that he'd fundamentally misjudged the situation. He'd thought he could push a Hollywood legend around on his show, and instead, he'd been the one who looked small. The scrambling of the production crew, the call for commercial break, the shifting lights, all of it underscored the chaos Anderson had created. This wasn't supposed to happen. Interviews don't end like this. Guests don't walk out. Audiences don't give standing ovations to empty chairs. But Anderson had created a situation so toxic, so disrespectful, that all the normal rules went out the window. What makes this moment resonate beyond just this specific interview is what it represents. How many times have we watched talk shows where hosts use their platform to belittle guests? How many times have we seen interviewers mistake cruelty for courage, aggression for honesty? How many times have celebrities sat there and taken it because they felt they had to, because walking out would hurt their image or their promotional tour? Harrison Ford broke that pattern. He showed that it's okay to remove yourself from situations where you're not being treated with basic respect. He showed that protecting your dignity matters more than playing along with someone's game. He showed that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply leave. And the audience's reaction showed that people are hungry for that kind of integrity. They're tired of watching hosts treat guests poorly. They're tired of manufactured conflict. They're tired of interviews that seek to tear people down rather than have genuine conversations. They want something better, and they applauded Harrison for demanding it. This wasn't about Harrison being unable to handle criticism. Throughout his career, he's faced plenty of criticism. He's had movies that failed, he's gotten bad reviews, he's dealt with all the ups and downs that come with being in the public eye for decades. This wasn't about thin skin or ego. This was about respect. This was about the difference between legitimate questions and personal attacks. This was about someone using their platform responsibly versus using it to hurt people for entertainment. This was about boundaries. And Harrison Ford, a man who's played heroes his entire career, showed what real heroism looks like. Not fighting, not aggression, just clear, calm assertion of boundaries and the willingness to walk away when those boundaries aren't respected. That's the story. That's the moment. That's why. 36 seconds was all it took for everything to fall apart, because Anderson Cooper made the mistake of thinking his platform gave him power over his guest. And Harrison Ford made it clear that respect isn't negotiable, no matter who's asking the questions or how big their show is. The image of Anderson sitting there, stunned, while the audience celebrated his guest's departure, is the perfect encapsulation of what happens when ego overtakes empathy, when ratings matter more than respect, when a host forgets that guests are human beings who deserve dignity. Harrison Ford walked off that stage with his head high, his integrity intact, and the full support of everyone who witnessed what happened. And Anderson Cooper was left sitting in the wreckage of an interview that had backfired so completely, so thoroughly, that there was no way to spin it, no way to recover, no way to pretend it had gone any other way than exactly how it looked. One man stood up for himself. One man refused to play along. One man drew a line and walked away. And in doing so, Harrison Ford gave everyone watching permission to do the same in their own lives when faced with disrespect masquerading as something legitimate. That's why this moment matters. That's why people will remember it. Not because of the spectacle, but because of the principle. The simple, powerful principle that you don't have to accept being treated poorly, no matter who's doing it or what platform they're doing it from. Harrison Ford walked off that stage, and he took his dignity with him. Anderson Cooper stayed in his chair and lost his.